Yes, we're back.
It is so great to be back, Ellie.
And we are out of the 5 books of Moses, out of the Pentateuch.
Yes.
So we are now in the part of the Hebrew Bible that's called Nevi'im, which means prophets. And we're in the book of Joshua. And the book of Joshua is arguably the most disturbing and violent book in the entire Hebrew Bible. It's basically a book about genocidal conquest.
Yeah, I don't think that's unfair. Yeah, I don't think that's unfair.
The basic story is that we have this character, Joshua, who takes over from Moses, who, by the way, we were introduced to in Numbers. So Joshua is a character that we were introduced to in the episode of, it's known as the episode of the spies, where Moses sends out these 12 people to go and scope out the land of Canaan, soon to be the land of Israel. And they come back with terrifying reports. But 2 of those people, Joshua and Caleb, come back with a kind of more positive outlook. And Joshua, from that story, ends up becoming the leader of the Israelites, right?
Yeah, that's right. In particular, their positive report is that God will be with them and they'll be able to conquer the land, right? And that's exactly what Joshua does. And yeah, no, indeed. And Joshua is a different kind of leader than Moses is, right? Joshua is in contact with God in some important ways, but Joshua is, in some ways, we might say, a sort of practical military leader, more so than Moses is, although there's a lot of complexities.
We're coming in at chapter 5. So what's happened in up to this point in the book basically is that Joshua is made the new leader of the Israelites, and he actually sends 2 spies of his own. And there's an incident with a prostitute named Rahab, who promises to sort of betray her people, in favor of the Israelites when they come in, if the Israelites spare her from the genocide that's about to take place.
Well, and part of what's really interesting about this story is this sense that people might already think, like people who are in the land might already think that the Israelites are going to prevail, and so are kind of making preparations for that eventuality.
Right. And then the Israelites, in a very sort of ceremonial fashion, cross the River Jordan. And that's the episode that happens right before what we're about to read. They cross the River Jordan with the Ark of the Covenant, and they take memorial stones from the river. That's a whole episode also. And now they're on the other side of the Jordan River. So they're on the western side, the western bank of the Jordan River, just in front of, before they get to Jericho. And that's where our episode starts. So why don't we jump in? There's going to be a lot to talk about today. This is a very complex and interesting and intriguing text, and there's going to be a lot to cover. So let's jump into the text, and we'll take it from there. Sound like a plan?
Yeah, totally. And I'm going to use Robert Alter's translation today.
Fantastic. Okay, so Joshua 5:2. Ba'etahi Amar Hashem El Yehoshua Aseh lecha charvot tzurim v'shuv mol et bnei Yisrael shenit.
At that time, the Lord said to Joshua, "Make you flint knives, and again circumcise the Israelites a second time."
I know we just read one verse, and we've got a lot to go, but a couple of things about this verse. First of all, Charvot Tsurim is a hapax. What is a hapax, Max?
So this is a Greek term, hapax legomenon, for a term, either a word or a phrase that only appears one time in a given body of text. So our body of text here in this case is biblical Hebrew, which is Tanakh, as well as the books that we know of that didn't make it into Tanakh. So it's a relatively small corpus, but even so, it's not all the time that we're coming upon these terms that only appear once in this body of text.
And technically speaking, it's not really a hapax because we're about to get it again in the next verse. But
But it's
this is the
limited to this
only
passage. Yeah, that's what.
exactly. This is the only place where we see charvot tsurim, which is how did Alter translate it? I have flint knives in the translation I'm staring at.
Flint knives as well, right? But it's a different word for flint than we get somewhere else, or at least a different resonance.
The other thing about this verse that is a little perplexing, I must say, right off the bat, is Vishuv molet b'nei Yisrael shenit. And once again, circumcise the children of Israel a second time. First of all, there's a kind of there's a superfluous nature of the way that this is being said, because you could get away with just saying and circumcise them again, but it's and circumcise them again a second time. So there's like extra words going on here, and it's also not entirely clear like what is the first circumcision that's being referred to in the sentence, right?
Yeah, no, that definitely seems true. Right, there's the sense of like how many circumcisions are there? Is it possible that there were sort of incomplete circumcisions of the group of people, and now this is kind of like a final one? Or are there maybe different traditions about the circumcision of the people before the conquest of the land that are being conflated a bit? Definitely unclear.
And the text itself is going to have something to say about this, and we'll get to that.
But in this series, we don't assume that that everything the text says should be taken at face value. Although we have so much reverence for the text.
But it's it's a perplexing kind of phrasing, and we'll come back to that. All right, next verse. 5:3 Vayas lo Yoshua charvot tsurim vayamal et bnei Yisrael el givat ha'aralot.
And Joshua made flint knives, and he circumcised the Israelites at the hill of foreskins.
Second hapax, givat ha'aralot, is a hapax also. And he translated it as to the hill of foreskins.
At the hill of foreskins.
He said at the hill of foreskins. Okay, the Hebrew is El Givat Ha'aralot, so a literal translation would be to the hill of foreskins.
Well, so one thing which is important is that prepositions in biblical Hebrew are pretty flexible. El in particular often means to, but definitely can have these different senses about location. So I wouldn't read into that too much without the context here.
This is actually a really interesting question because I think we have another ambiguity in just our second verse already.
Totally. Yeah.
Is the person who's writing this referring to a name place that the people who are reading it would have already recognized? In other words,
I assume so. Yeah.
That's
how I take it. Yeah.
Is that like a place that people would have recognized? And so now we're sort of giving the backstory to the name of a place that people would have known? Yeah. Or is it a description of what's about to happen, or of what's happening rather? Is it a description? Is it saying like, and he created a hill of foreskins kind of? And what I'd love for you to do, Max, is just take a quick peek at the Septuagint, the early Greek translation. And I'd like to see if they have a read on which direction to lean in for this.
Epi tu kalumenu topu bunos ton acrobustion. So what the Septuagint here has is at the so-called place, Hill of Foreskins, right? Like the place called the Hill of Foreskins.
So it's definitely leaning in that direction that we were assuming.
Yeah. So it seems to be talking about a place that would be recognizable. That's how the Septuagint takes it. Now, that being said, the Septuagint was probably, a decent bit after people wouldn't necessarily have known where the Hill of Foreskins was, or it wouldn't have been as recognizable a landmark, right? Joshua is a relatively early book of the Bible. So, maybe even up to like half a millennium before the Septuagint. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. But so I think that it's taking what's quite a reasonable read, but I wouldn't say that we should assume that this has any kind of authority in interpreting our original Hebrew text.
Sure. We will be coming back to some more Septuagint in just a little bit. All right, next verse.
Always fun to check the Greek.
וזה הדבר אשר מל יהושע כל העם היוצא ממצרים, הזכרים כל אנשי המלחמה מתו במדבר בדרך בצאתם ממצרים.
And this is the reason that Joshua circumcised them. All the people who had come out of Egypt, all the males, the men of war, had died out on the way in the wilderness when they came out of Egypt.
כי מולים היו כל העם היוצאים, וכל העם הילודים במדבר בדרך בצאתם ממצרים לא מלו.
For all the people who came out were circumcised, but all the people who were born in the wilderness on the way when they came out of Egypt were not circumcised. Now, just pausing for a second here, can you remind me, Ellie, did we have any kind of explicit statement of this in the Torah, that all the people were circumcised? So I know rabbinic tradition really loves to read into this and to talk about the real importance that was placed on circumcision among the Israelites when they were enslaved in Egypt. But, circumcision doesn't play much of a role in the Exodus story at all that I can recall.
So, Max, as you know, in this series, we are going exhaustively in chronological order through all of the texts. So
you're
if
right,
there had been one,
we would have talked
we
about
would have
it.
come across it.
You're right. You're right.
It's an excellent question. The only two texts, as we covered in previous videos, we have Tzipporah, we have the mysterious Exodus 4 text, and we have the Exodus 12 text, which is about circumcision in the Passover. And there is literally, this is the first time we're hearing anything about the circumcision status of people coming out of Egypt or the practice of circumcision in the desert. This is just like not something we had. And of course, as we were mentioning in the first verse, it's answering this question that, of course, anyone reading this would have, which is like, what do you mean? And again, circumcise the children of Israel a second time. So it's like we're getting in the text itself an answer to that question, which, spoiler alert, I think a lot of Bible critics would suggest is evidence probably of a later layer of this text coming in here.
Yeah, no, definitely. That makes sense. And, we'll have to keep evaluating as we go. And it's so tough with these early books of the prophets to figure out some of the different layers. I mean, just one thing to note is that sometimes there are parts of these stories in the sort of historical books of early prophets where it does seem like there's material that's significantly later, but it also does appear often that there's sort of these folk stories from a variety maybe of periods that are being incorporated to this historical narrative that we're getting.
All right, but we're not done yet with our explanation.
No, we're not done. No, indeed.
The explanation continues in the text in verse 6. Ki 40 shana alchu bnei Yisrael b'midbar ad tom kol hagoy anshe milchama yotzim mitzrayim asher lo sham'u b'kol Hashem asher nishba Hashem lahem levilti harotam et haaretz asher nishba Hashem lavotam latet lanu eretz zavat chalav udvash.
For 40 years did the Israelites go on in the wilderness until the whole generation was finished, the men of war coming out of Egypt, who had not heeded the Lord's voice, as the Lord had vowed to them not to show them the land that the Lord had vowed to their fathers to give to us, a land flowing with milk and honey.
Ve'et bneihem hekim tachtam otam mal Yehoshua ki arelim hayu ki lo malu otam badarach.
And their sons he put up in their stead. Them did Joshua circumcise, for they were uncircumcised, as they had not been circumcised on the way.
Vayhi kasher tamu kol hagoy lihimol vayishvu tachtam b'machaneh ad chayotam.
And it happened when the whole nation had finished being circumcised, they remained in their place until they revived.
Vayomer Hashem el Yoshua hayom galoti et cherpat Mitzrayim me'alechem. Gilgal.
And the Lord said to Joshua, I have rolled away from you the shame of Egypt, and the name of the place has been called Gilgal to this day, which is a pun in Hebrew.
Right. Gilgal means like a round stone or a rolling stone, something like that. And to me, it almost has like an onomatopoeic kind of quality to it. Gal, 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 right? Like a Gilgal, like a rolling kind of stone or a wheel or something. But here it's like God rolled back how does Alter translate it? Cherpat Mitzrayim?
The shame of Egypt. Yeah.
Right. And
And
JPS
he
says disgrace.
yeah,
Yeah.
and what Robert Alter notes in his commentary is that the shame of Egypt can refer both to slavery and to being uncircumcised.
Right. And I mean, that's, I think, an open question here, and may actually even be a way of identifying some of the layers of the text of what's going on here. But what is the object of the shame of Egypt here? So he's saying either the fact that they were not circumcised, which would contradict what we said before that they were circumcised.
Well, or it could be being in an Egyptian condition or something like that, right? Would be being
Right.
uncircumcised. So it could be that the previous generation was circumcised, but the shame of Egypt is a sort of residual from slavery in some way.
But do you see what I'm saying? If Cherpat
Mhm.
Mitzrayim is that they weren't circumcised, that contradicts what we just said, that they were
Well,
circumcised in
mm,
Egypt and stopped circumcising in the desert.
but my point being that this newer generation now has the shame of Egypt rolled away. This newer generation was born in the wilderness, but it's
Right.
possible that they could still be identified with Egypt in a way. Maybe there's a sense in which actually fully removing some of the mark of Egypt takes actually more than a generation. It can't be done by the people who actually left Egypt, but has to be done by their descendants.
Right. I'm just trying to, but again, like Alter gives two ideas here. One is
Yeah,
that
yeah,
the disgrace could be the uncircumcision, and the other
yeah,
is that it's just the general disgrace of
yeah.
having come out of
Well,
slavery.
and I totally agree with you that it's very possible here, and perhaps even plausible, that the shame of Egypt here implies that the previous generation was not circumcised. And so then there's a sort of interpolation in addition when the text a little bit before says the previous generation was circumcised. Certainly, it seems like we're getting a strong authorial voice here, which is very interesting, right? More than in a lot of passages in the Torah, certainly, and even more than in a lot of passages in the prophets. This part of this historical part of prophets, although this sort of narrative voice, authorial voice, is not uncommon in the earlier parts of prophets.
Yeah, although I would say it feels almost like an editorial, right? Like this is like this whole explanation that's
Yeah.
answering the question that we had in the first verse feels like an insert, like a, oh,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
might be wondering what we're talking about here because we
Yeah, yeah.
we we know that you read those earlier books and there was no
Yeah,
mention
yeah.
of this.
That makes sense.
So
Yeah.
here's an explanation. All right, let's just
Yeah.
finish off
Yeah,
the
yeah.
the text that we're going to be reading, and then we'll come back because the Septuagint has a very, very different take here,
Great.
which
All
I
right. So we're
can't wait to get to. But
continuing at verse 10.
yes, Joshua 5:10, Vayachanu b'nei Yisrael b'Gilgal, Vayasu et haPesach be'arba'a asar yom lachodesh, ba'erev be'arvot Yericho.
And the Israelites encamped at Gilgal and performed the Passover rite on the 14th day of the month in the evening on the plains of Jericho.
ויאכלו מעבור הארץ ממחרת הפסח מצות וקלוי בעצם היום הזה.
And they ate from the yield of the land from the day after the Passover sacrifice, the flatbread and parched grain on that very day.
וישבות המן ממחרת באוכלם מעבור הארץ, ולא היה עוד לבני ישראל מן, ויאכלו מתבואת ארץ כנען בשנה ההיא.
And the manna ceased on the day after, when they ate from the yield of the land, and the Israelites no longer had manna, and they ate from the produce of the land of Canaan in that year.
All right, so that's our text.
Yeah, one thing to just note briefly is the connection here of Passover with circumcision, the Passover sacrifice with circumcision.
Ding, ding, ding. What does that remind you of, Max?
Right,
Previous
so that
text
reminds
study?
us of Exodus 12, of course. Right,
Exactly.
and so having the mention of Passover here, it might be that was the time of year, but it fits really well with trying to remind everyone maybe of this this ritual aspect of only circumcised folks participating in the Passover sacrifice, and it might also imply that that's part of the primary significance of circumcision, right? We will see in prophets circumcision come to be an identity marker, at least as a sort of group identity marker much more strongly. But here it's still, I think, quite open that a lot of its primary significance maybe is ritual related to this sort of cult practice of the Passover sacrifice.
Yeah, and spoiler alert, we're definitely going to have a conversation about who wrote this text, and we're going to rely on some of these clues. But before we do that, I want to come back to our editorial. And Max, if you would do me the honor of reading those verses in the Septuagint, because I think there may be something to talk about here.
Great. Yeah. So where do you want to start here? And this is the reason with verse 4?
Yes.
Hondetropon perie katharen Iesus tous huios Israel hosoi pote egenonto ente hodoi kai hosoi pote aperitmetoi esan ton exeleluthoton ex Aegyptu. And in accord with this reason, he sort of a purified, sort of circumcised, sort of purified. Let me check on this word.
I think that's a very, first of all, I think that's an important difference.
You're right. I was actually wondering. So actually, at first, I mean, this is part of the problem. At first glance, I just assumed that this was another word for circumcise. But then when I looked at it again, I was like, you know what? I mean, it is a different term. I should really look it up. Yeah. So, and for this reason, Joshua purified or really purified. There's an intensifier. So like completely purified the Israelites, whichever ones had come out of Egypt.
There's going to be more. I predict, Max, not speaking Greek, I predict that there are going to be more differences that are really important.
So they're reading into this. The purification leaves a lot of questions about why.
Right, and another question. And this is one of those things, we've talked about the Septuagint in 2 previous text studies. The first one was Genesis 17, where I think we made a pretty strong case that it was working off of a different manuscript than the Masoretic text that we have. We also talked about the Septuagint in Exodus 4, where they were clearly exercising editorial translation discretion when instead of saying that God sought to kill Moses, they said that an angel of God sought to kill Moses. And here, the question would be, in what we're talking about right now, is, are they working off of a different source text, or are they exerting translator's discretion or whatever?
No, that's a great question. It's quite plausible that there was a different manuscript reading different source texts, and I'd be really curious to look into the history of this, if we have any Hebrew manuscripts that maybe have a different word here. I don't have an edition I can easily check offhand.
All right, but let's keep going, because the differences, I think, are going to get even more interesting.
Okay, so Tesrakonta gar kai duo ete en astrapai Israel en te eremoi te marbaritidi dio aperitme toi esan hoi pleistoi auton ton machimon ton exeleluthoton ex geis Aegyptu hoi ap ethesantes ton entolon tu theu hois kai diorisen me iden autusten gen hen omosen kurios tois patrasen auton dunai hemin gen hreusan gala kaimeli. Yeah, there's a big difference. Okay, let's just summarize what's happening in the Greek text here and some of the differences. So one of the differences is that there's this claim that most of the ones who had gone out of Egypt were uncircumcised, which is the exact opposite of what we had in the Masoretic text, in the Torah text, in the Tanakh text that we use now. So that's just like the first kind of wild thing to make sense of here. Now, I think that the Septuagint version is quite plausible, right? I mean, it makes a lot of sense. But
I
there's
would
also
say that
not
the
this
Septuagint
comparison
version makes more sense than the Masoretic version. That would be my...
Right. in the
Like,
Masoretic version, there's this attempt to really separate strongly between the generation that went out of Egypt, which was circumcised, and the new generation born in the desert, which wasn't. But in the Septuagint text, we just kind of all of them lumped together, right? And saying like, look, like they weren't circumcised, they were in the desert.
the Greek text says that many of the warriors who left Egypt and went into the desert, not only were they not circumcised, they were not circumcised because they were bad Jews or bad Israelites,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
they
yeah,
had decided
yeah,
not to
yeah.
circumcise themselves. And then they decided not to circumcise their children. And what does the Greek text tell us further? That these people were punished by not seeing the land. Only their children would be able to see the land, but their children would only be able to see the land if they were circumcised. And that's what this circumcision is.
Yeah, Ellie, in the Greek text, is it clear if they're disobeying God with respect to circumcision or with respect to the other stuff for which they're barred from the land in the Hebrew version?
To my I don't speak Greek like you do, and I would be very curious for you to dig into this verse a little bit. But what we're talking about here is verse 6. So Joshua
Yeah,
5
yeah.
6. My understanding from the translations that I've read of the Septuagint is that it is talking about the fact that they're not circumcised. That's the thing that they were disobeying God with, and that they're
Mm.
being punished for that by not seeing the land.
Interesting.
Is
Yeah,
that
yeah. No,
is that supported in the Greek?
it's unclear. It's unclear in the Greek. Um, yeah, yeah. So um, yeah, yeah. It just doesn't make clear in the Greek, as far as I can tell, what it in what respect they're disobeying God. Hmm. That's really interesting. So I mean, definitely though, the Septuagint text here is reading into the story a lot. Now, whether that's an interpretive move, whether that's based on some kind of manuscript difference, is very hard to say.
I want to shift or pivot on this point a
Yeah.
little bit,
Mhm.
because I think when we want to sort of try to understand who wrote this text and when this text was written, this gives us a bit of an opportunity.
Great.
It feels
Yeah.
very much to me like the Septuagint is coming at this from a context of there are Jews who aren't circumcising, and this is a problem. Like,
Hmm. Oh, that's so
this
interesting.
kind of editorializing to me sounds like it's coming from a culture where a concern about Jews not circumcising is present. And to me, that makes perfect sense if the Septuagint editorializing isn't really based on, it's like if we take it not as it's based on a model of like they have a different manuscript, but no, they're actually sort of reacting and putting their thumb on the scale a little bit in the translation, because at their time, the presence of Jews who aren't circumcising is an actual concern. And so
Yeah. Hmm.
does that sound right to you?
Yeah. I mean, that's super interesting. That's really possible. I mean, one thing that I was thinking about too, though, is that if we think that the ending of this story with a Passover sacrifice is really integral to the discussion of circumcision that comes before. And I'm tempted in that direction, and Robert Alter in his commentary is tempted in that direction as well. Then that would be a big difference from the context of the Septuagint, where the sort of ritual aspects of the temple and these sort of cultic practices in relation to sacrifices are less prominent, right? The Septuagint being from a community not in the land of Israel, and therefore, sort of looking for interpretations of the text which don't rely on a lot of these priestly apparatuses, these kinds of practices. So I think what you're saying is quite possible, but it might also be what we see in the Septuagint text coming from this attempt to make sense of the text at all while wanting to downplay the importance of sacrifices.
Yeah, the thing is though that the Masoretic text is also doing this inner kind of midrashic move. It's like a
Yeah.
proto midrashic inner hermeneutic where it's trying to answer a question that it posed, right? What do you mean the second circumcision? What do you mean that this, like, where is this new information? They're trying also. So it's almost like they're, to me, that whole like editorial section feels like a later layer in both the Septuagint
Hmm.
and in the Masoretic text, and that the original
Oh,
text
interesting.
just didn't have that. But that brings us to the question of who wrote the original text.
Well, and
And
also to what extent are we relying on earlier folk traditions?
right,
Yeah.
to what extent are we relying on earlier folk churches? But also, like, just who's writing this book, Max? Who is writing the book of Joshua? And that's a
Yeah. Yeah.
live question among
Yeah.
Bible scholars. And
Totally.
the camp that I am very much finding myself in, specifically about the passage that we're covering today, is that Joshua 5, 2 through, what was it, 12
12.
that we read, I think it's a priestly text.
Wow.
Um,
Really? Yeah. 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 That's
I
possible.
think it's a priestly text, and I actually think that the previous
Hmm.
chapter, the part where we get the Israelites crossing the Jordan River, is
Mhm,
also
mhm.
kind of a priestly text. And I say this for a number of reasons.
Yeah.
Um, the kind of like most obvious reason to me is narrative. So if we think about the priestly text as a complete narrative, it doesn't really like it doesn't make sense to end it with Moses dying and like looking over into the land of Israel. The promise that we get in Genesis 17 is that God's going to give the land to the Israelites if they keep the covenant. It's this covenantal thing that we talked about in our study on Genesis 17. So to me, this is like, from a narrative perspective, this makes sense as the end, as like the third act, if you will, of the priestly source, that this is the promise fulfilled. And I mean, there are just so many other kinds of
Hmm.
linguistic and stylistic connections between the
Yeah.
passage that we read today and the priestly sources that convince me of this further. I'm setting aside the editorial thing because I think
Yeah.
that may have been a later addition, the sort of that
Hmm.
explanation thing where we talked about the Septuagint and the Masoretic text having a
Hmm.
slightly different take on, what happened after Egypt and what happened in
Yeah.
the wilderness. But so
Yeah.
setting that
Yeah.
aside, but the rest of this passage to me feels, and again, crossing the Jordan too, there are just so many linguistic markers, thematic markers, the calendar matching up with the
Yeah.
priestly
Yeah. Yeah.
calendar
Yeah.
being like
Hmm.
a super important thing,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
fact that circumcision is important, the connection between circumcision
Yeah. Yeah.
and the Passover, the ending of the manna coming down,
Yeah.
all of
Yeah.
this stuff to me seems like at least this part of Joshua is actually the end of the priestly source. What do you think,
Yeah, I mean,
Max?
yeah, no, no, this is super fascinating. Thank you so much for laying that out, Ellie. I mean, one thing which I would add is that the Deuteronomist or Deuteronomy just doesn't seem that interested in circumcision. And when they do mention circumcision, as we discussed in our text study, it is, often this kind of metaphorical sense of circumcision, which is being developed, right? And so, I think this quite visceral and also sort of ritual mention of circumcision seems to count against a Deuteronomic author, even though that sort of editorializing might be associated with uh, Deuteronomic sources in other parts of the early books of prophets. The sort of structure of this story does seem to count against the possibility that it's a Deuteronomic source. Um, and yeah, I mean, and right, and two of our mentions of circumcision, and indeed our only mentions of circumcision legal passages in the Torah, as we discuss in our other text studies, do seem to be priestly sources.
I think the answer to the question who wrote the book of Joshua is a lot of people. I mean, I really
Yeah,
think
yeah.
that's the honest answer. But this passage in particular, and again, if you go back to the passage where they're crossing the Jordan, the emphasis on the priests, right? The priests
Hmm.
carrying
Hmm.
the Ark of the Covenant. There's actually, they refer to the Ark of the Covenant in various different ways, but we do get the very, you know, the priestly appellation of a dut. Aron Ha'idut. We get that. When it talks about, and this is kind of poetic and really interesting, when the narrative describes how the River Jordan stops flowing, right, in a kind of mirroring of the splitting of the Red Sea, it uses the word the rooted word karet for the rivers to stop flowing, which is also kind of like a throwback to the karet that we saw in Genesis 17. It's just like it all comes together for me as this part, and especially the stuff with circumcision and Passover. This is priestly.
Well, if I can offer just a brief, closing note, I think one of the things that's so interesting about this text, and why I'm so glad that we're studying it, why I'll be happy to kind of be able to refer back to it, is that it does seem like a transitional text in some important ways, right? Where it both has some of these ritual aspects, and it has these sort of explicit references to the Torah, and also it is sort of setting up maybe some of these identity issues with circumcision, which then get really developed in the Septuagint version. And so I think this text contains a lot. And it's also partly for me why it's so confusing to really know what to make of. And of course, there's so much possible historical context that's lost, but always great to study it.